Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys briefly today. I want to start by thanking you for all you do for students, especially in the face of such a challenging school year. I thank you as a partner with many of you, but I also thank you as a kindergarten parent. It's been a tough year. You might see a little kindergartner bebop in here, so hopefully he's occupied for a minute. But like Tracy said, my name is Audrey Harrell, and I'm a district partnership specialist at Pearson, and I support districts throughout our home state here in North Carolina, as well as other states in the Southeast. There are a few big topics of concern that I've heard repeatedly throughout conversations and throughout this conference. One is a decline in district enrollment. I did read recently there are 65,000 fewer students in our districts this year than last year. And the other focus is on learning loss, specifically gaps in K-5 reading and math. At Pearson, we're really here to help you close those learning gaps with the summer school partnership. Our summer partnerships have always really focused on high school credit recovery, and we'll certainly continue to do that with prescriptive courses for high school students, as we always have. But this year we do have some different options, and one is laser focused on critical K-8 with the Summer Smarts program. Focuses specifically on reading and math to get students back up to speed. It offers diagnostic courses that prescribe content based on those learning gaps. The content is designed to be engaging and age appropriate, and there is a synchronous component where teachers can individualize instruction and facilitate learning. So there is live instruction that is available for support there. I'm going to put some information in the chat if that's something of interest to you. It's a quick video you can check out after this session, as well as my contact information. And I'd love the opportunity to collaborate with you and provide support to your students this summer and throughout the year. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Miller and Dr. Tigal to share with you information about testing and accountability. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you today.
All right, Patrick, you'll kick us off.
All right. Well, my name is Patrick Miller, and I'm the superintendent in Greene County.
And Patrick won't tell you, but he was the North Carolina Superintendent of the Year and served on as an advisor to the State Board of Ed, and one of the, if not the longest tenured, one of the top 2 longest tenured superintendents in our state right now, and a voice for many educators advocating at the national level. Patrick's probably the most connected at the national level of anybody in North Carolina right now. So very pleased to have him on the meeting with us today. And he brings that practical voice. He's in the field, knows what's going on. I'm David Stegall. I'm the Deputy State Superintendent of Innovation. And I am a former teacher, principal, curriculum director, and superintendent, and spent a year in the Middle East and North Africa planning some schools in some very tough to staff areas and some not so tough to staff areas like in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So quite an experience, but been back in North Carolina at DPI since 2019. So we're here to give you some updates, because what is on everyone's mind is what is the landscape now for testing and accountability, and what options do we have? And so we hope to make this as informal as possible. And by that, I mean, if you have questions, we ask you to please put them in the chat. We'll try to answer as many along the way as we can, and those we can't along the way, we'll try to wrap up at the end with some answers. And as I say, most of my presentations, please extend grace to us. We don't have all the answers. I wish we did, and we will certainly do our best to find them if we don't have them. So hope
we'll make them up.
What's that?
Or we'll make it up.
We'll make it up. You won't know the difference. So as long as we sound convincing, you'll probably believe us. So that's all that matters. So one of the first things I will start with, being at DPI, and I was probably this guy as a superintendent, I get asked a lot, why does the DPI or the state board just cancel EOCs and EOGs? Those are not decisions that can be made by the State Department of Public Instruction or by the state board. Testing and accountability is required by the federal law with our ESSA plan and by state law. And some people say, well, what happens if we just don't do the federal law? Well, if you get any federal money, Title I, II, III, IV, V, 9, all that comes from federal government. It means you have to comply with everything they say. And our ESSA plan dictates that we have an accountability system that has growth and performance. And so, well, it really has to have performance, but as the the most prominent feature of our testing must be about performance, overall performance. So I start with that in mind, and I'll let you know that this past fall, one of the things that my team did, as a deputy superintendent of innovation, I oversee quite a number of divisions, and one of those that I have been overseeing is accountability and testing. And we contacted the federal government, talked to USED and said, we would like to submit a waiver to waive our state accountability system and to waive the 95% rule that we must test 95% of students. The previous administration, Betsy DeVos in particular, sent a letter to not just to us, to all 50 states, very strongly worded, and said, do not ask because we're not giving it. Don't ask for a waiver. It will not be coming. That is not a consideration, which was discouraging. But we also knew that an election was coming up. And in November after the election, we knew that meant a likely change in the Secretary of Ed. So we started in December in anticipation of a new administration starting. We backwards mapped knowing that we'd like to submit it on January 21. Why January 21? It's the day after the inauguration. And we knew that that would be the earliest we could submit something. You have to have a 30-day public feedback period. And we backed our public feedback to middle of December so that we'd have plenty of time to share with the state board our request. So we submitted, in North Carolina, we submitted a federal waiver in the fall, in December. We started the public feedback. We submitted January 21. We noted the difficulties of the pandemic on schools and families. And what we requested was a waiver of the accountability. In other words, the letter grading, the comparison of schools, any ramifications that come back on teachers or schools, the 95% requirement. And if you don't know what the 95% requirement is, what it states is you must test at least 95% for any student below that. So if you test 90%, no matter what your score is, they will deduct 5% off count 5% as failing grades, because you have to count no less than 95% of your total student population in the scores. If you only test 90%, they will add in 5% of failed grades, which will obviously impact you. So, and the understanding rationale is they don't want people to game the system and tell certain students to stay home, not test certain students and so forth. So we asked for a waiver of the 95% for this year only. We asked for a waiver of the accountability measures, and we did maintain, as the federal government has strongly suggested and as our state legislators have suggested, we do need data. We do need a snapshot of where our children are and be able to compare that to the standards, not just what you have locally, which you're doing a ton with. We need to be able to say and ascertain with some level of certainty what our students are doing well in and what they're not doing well in that we can help them with. So we sent that waiver in January 21. Then on February 22nd, one month after our waiver went in, we were the first or second state to get a waiver in. The USED, under the new administration, sent out some new guidance, and in it they gave a template, and they said, we anticipate every state asking for a waiver. And we, as I mentioned, we had already done ours, and they said, here's the template we'd like for you to use. We want you to do a 30-day wait period. And our worry was we're gonna have to start all over again because they came out with a new process. Yesterday, we had a meeting again with USED, and they did commit that our waiver had all the components necessary. It did meet all the requirements they're asking other states. So we will not have to resubmit or start over from scratch, which is good. So we have our waiver in place. We're front of the line now. I don't know if they're going to do it state by state, or some people anticipate they may do a national waiver. Everyone that applied, they'll just do a blanket, all of us at the same time. But we hope to hear something sooner rather than later. So accountability and school identification, it's not required to implement and report the results of the accountability system under this waiver. These are things you could do. And it's what we asked for. We asked for the testing, but not the accountability piece and the pieces tied to EVOS. And again, the letter grading system and all TSI, CSI, all the negative components of it, and negative as far as punitive pieces. We do want to make sure that the data is meaningful to schools and districts. So the waiver does allow us to pause calculating progress towards long-term goals, and it does allow us to pause creating an accountability piece for 2021. As you all know, we didn't have an end-of-grade and end-of-course test in 1920 as well. So this is actually going to give us 2 years in a row with no accountability data as a state. I'll speak to that in just a moment when we talk about the North Carolina piece of this, but our accountability system is going to have a gap of 2 years that is used for predictive measures on how schools and districts and students are doing. And so we're going to have we have a chasm to jump and leap through at some point to figure out what's our new normal and how to make sure we're calculating growth in a meaningful way. And as I mentioned, our waiver could and did request a waiver of participation for parents and students who did not feel comfortable and could not come on in an alternative date or an alternative setting. It does allow us to, if need be, not have the 95% participation. We have been told each state that receives a waiver will not have to identify new CSI and TSI schools. And for those that are not familiar, this is the lower 5% of schools that are continually struggling and low performing, not just as a collective, but with subgroups. So we would pause that identification. A downside of that, if you're a CSI or TSI school and you've made progress, a downside is you can't come out of it yet either, because we can't use that data this year. And there are a number of schools who have done amazing stuff. I mean, just put processes in place and hired staff that really made completely new gains that they have not seen before. And unfortunately, they won't be able to use data this year to come out of CSI or TSI. We will continue to provide them support. Our team of district and regional support leads from DPI will still continue to support them throughout next year. But we fully anticipate that they'll be able to show that growth next year and hopefully come out of TSI and CSI if they're identified. Identification would be required to resume. Again, us identifying the lowest performing, the lowest 5% in the state would resume beginning with the fall of this coming year or this year. Also, with the waiver availability, it was stated that states must publicly report the percentage of students not assessed and disaggregate by subgroup. So what the federal government did not want is getting a waiver and some school, not that anybody would do this, but some school testing only their top students and say only 40% of students are tested. And it would not truly give a reflection of those most vulnerable students. And they want to make sure that we're looking at the most vulnerable students in every way possible. So if you test 80%, that will be publicized. It won't count against you, but it will be public. It will also show by subgroups how your students are doing. So they're trying to keep us from hiding. Nobody is planning on doing that. We all know that, but it is a noble effort to make sure that there aren't any incentives to hide students and not test students that really might be vulnerable. And they continue to encourage us to work with our state systems and look at high stakes testings required by the state as well as we move through this. Now, even with a waiver, it maintains the all state and local report card requirements, including disaggregating all data by student subgroups must stay. This is still a federal requirement. So we will still, although we won't have letter grades and student and school rankings and those type of things, we will have to show, as I said before, percentage of students that took the test, how the subgroups are doing, and some demographic data about our students. We must also address chronic absenteeism, and there is a federal and a state definition for that. We collect that data through our data collection system, our SIS, and we would have to promote or at least publicly report that as a state as well. And one last thing, obviously, if you know the student report card, the school report card, you know it also displays the student access to technology, which for most districts is going to be much higher than it has ever been due to the pandemic. School and district leaders are asked to make a good faith effort to test all students, as we said, but safety is a priority. There are flexibility. So when a family, and we've had some reach out to us, they've reached out to you, they've reached out to legislators and say, I don't feel comfortable with my child being in a room with 20 other students, or I don't feel comfortable with whatever that may be. So we're allowed to give some of the flexibility, such as shorter versions of a test. We're allowed to give remote administration. In other words, if it allows and it can be monitored, and we're doing that with our K-3 assessments now and other assessments. If it's feasible, we can do remote instruction. We can extend the testing window, and we'll get into that in just a moment. We've been typically locked into just a short window of time, and the end of the school year, we're allowed to extend on the front end and on the back end to give plenty of time. And we're allowed to and encouraged to extend the testing window for English language proficiency test. When I talk about extended the window, it also allows us to not have to test every student at the same time. So you could have alternative testing sites, a YMCA, a civic center, a church, where as long as you provide the same level of accountability with monitoring and administration, follow the rules, you can do it off-site. You can do it in different days. Some students come on one, some come on the other. So the flexibilities do exist to encourage as many students as possible and to encourage schools to make a good faith effort to test as many students as possible. Again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we've already expanded the testing window testing outside the window and extending English language proficiency testing. And those have been extended by 3 weeks. The testing outside the window, well, we can now test students up through July 5th of the year. And again, you have lots of flexibilities about when you can and how many students have to be together when you do it, what sites you can do it at, and if possible, even remotely. We've also, as you know, some schools have just now, in fact, a few districts are just now for the first time this academic year, sending students back face-to-face within a week or two. First time students have been in the building. So we are still completing, today was the deadline, 3rd grade BOG. And some people go, well, why does it matter now? Well, the BOG is we have to have a starting point, and the window has been extended. There are very few that have to use it because many districts have utilized other methods to get their testing done, but we've tried every feasible way to allow testing to continue. What's not on here that we've also done, we had students who in high school who had first semester courses that are semester long, and they required an EOC. We have extended that testing window so that if they did not feel comfortable testing right away, they can test all the way through again July, even though they took the class in the fall. But the downside of that, as we all know, is you can forget a lot between December and January and July. But being as open to and supportive as possible, we have extended that testing window through July, even for the fall EOGs and EOCs. We may discuss English language proficiency testing opportunities for the summer and for even through the fall of 2021 as need be. The federal government in particular has really stressed that we need to do everything possible to assess our English language students to make sure what the need is and that we are providing that support. I'll pause. I know I've been zooming through here. Any questions I need to address before I jump to the next slide? I'll take that silence as an affirmative. We're good to go. So here's where, once we get, if we receive the waiver, which we anticipate, if we get the federal waiver that says we can decouple accountability from testing, in other words, we can test, but not have to count the test towards our accountability measures. If we get the waiver for the 95% rule, we then have to engage our North Carolina General Assembly, because the testing and accountability for North Carolina is always, part of it is also in state statute. Things like school performance grades, A through F. That's not a federal statute, that's our federal rule. That is a state statute. 80-20 weighting for performance and growth. The only thing the federal government says, as I said before, that when I stumbled on my words, that the largest portion of our accountability system must be at least a majority towards proficiency. So at least, we interpret that as at least 51% must be for proficiency. And the other 49% can be a lot of things. It can be growth, it can be student surveys, it can be absenteeism, attendance, it can be college career readiness. There are lots of things we can put in that 49%. But right now, our state statute is very clear. It's only two things: 80% proficiency, 20% growth. So if we're going to move away from that, we must engage with our state leaders for that. If we have a waiver, federal waiver, if we don't approach our General Assembly, it could impact principal pay, and we don't want that. Principal pay is tied to student achievement, and if we don't ask for a grace period, a hold harmless, if you will, for principals and for certain teachers who get bonuses, that are tied to accountability, we might have issues. We also have EVOS that in North Carolina state statute that is tied to our accountability model. We have to get permission from our state government and state legislators to pause our EVOS growth measures for teachers and schools. And as I mentioned, growth is a part of our state accountability system, not the federal, but our state system. If we don't ask our General Assembly to pause that, then even if you don't test everyone, growth would still be part of the calculations, and that would be probably harmful to most districts and most schools, given the pandemic and the issues it's presented you with. All right, so what are we doing? We've talked about the federal waiver. We hope to hear back very soon. Once we do that, we've already pre-engaged with our state General Assembly members, especially the education chairs and Senator Berger and others. And our state superintendent has been very active, as have our legislative liaisons from the department. We're prepared once we hear from the federal government to work through our state General Assembly. Parallel to that, if you happen to see Ms. Truitt speak this morning, you heard her speak about the Polaris and her 4 pillars in that. One of those was human capital, one was literacy, one was testing and accountability task force. I'll be chairing that. She's asked me to chair that, and that will be focused on a number of things and with feedback from a number of groups. For example, NCSSA has given us feedback on what they as a collective, the Superintendents Association, what they as a collective think would be beneficial for our state accountability system to be comprised of. We've heard from the Innovation Project, TIP. We've heard from SREB, the state board had a task, but we've had lots and lots of groups who have given us their recommendations and given the General Assembly their recommendations. This task force that I'll be chairing will take all those considerations, and our job is not to create anything new. Our job is to curate, communicate, and be able to give a picture to the General Assembly of the collective recommendations. What we're hoping to do, as you heard Ms. Truitt say this morning, is create a graduate profile. And if you've been in North Carolina for a number of years, you know we've had a graduate profile in the past. And what we're saying with a graduate profile is, what should our students be able to demonstrate when they graduate? And that includes college and career readiness. That includes some skills and attributes that they should be able to have. And how do we put that in a graduate profile? That we don't want the tail wagging the dog. We don't want testing driving everything we do. We want our end in mind, our picture, our graduate profile driving the work we do, tying everything to our desired end product. And students aren't products per se, but students are our collective human capital that we're trying to prepare. So the graduate profile is one of our key focuses. We're also looking at making, with this recommendation to the state General Assembly, a multi-measure model for testing and accountability that incorporates things like our innovative assessment pilot, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. We want to, if you heard Ms. Truitt speak this morning, you've heard probably NCPAPA, NCSSA, NCASA, most anyone that's working in education has proposed a more broad and multi-pronged approach to accountability. And we could get into what those things could be. And I've mentioned a few now: credentials of value, college readiness, an ACT score, maybe student surveys, there's a lot of things that could be considered, but more comprehensive formative assessments along the way throughout the year instead of just one summative assessment as part of the multi-measure approach to show what a student can do and know. We're also focused, as you heard her speak this morning, on competency-based education, moving away from seat time and compliance and more to students that being able to demonstrate proficiency and mastery. We're also, again, one other thing that this task force will be focused on is redesigning our school report card template to include these key components, not just an A through F grade. We would love to move away from A through F. We don't have the authority, and we've engaged our state leadership. I can't speak for them, but we have advocated for something, either a STAR system or having 2 separate measures instead of an 80-20 model. Maybe have a measure for proficiency and a separate measure for growth, and report those separately, because it paints a very different picture for, especially from some of our at-risk schools. the work they've done with growth, and not just at-risk schools, a lot of schools. The growth sometimes is very different than the overall proficiency. What we're going to do, again, this task force, I'll show you who's on it in just a moment. We're not creating new. So I don't want people to think we've done this work. Our job is to collect, curate, and communicate what has been done. We want to present the General Assembly because they've gotten so much from so many people. None of us want them to get lost in just the multitude of recommendations. We want one voice that consolidates all those recommendations into one product, a graduate profile, multi-measured model for accountability. And we hope to present that to our General Assembly members. So as you see on this slide, right now, here are the members of the task force right now. Again, I'm chairing it. You see people from the General Assembly on here, superintendents. We have a couple of superintendents on here. We've got nonprofits on here, Teacher of the Year for the North Carolina UNC system, My Future NC, lots and lots of perspectives. Are there going to be perspectives that aren't on here? I think you could have 100 people and still not have every perspective on here. That's why, in addition to these people, we have the recommendations of those advocacy groups. They have sent the department and the General Assembly recommendations from their advocacy groups. So even if the specific person may not be on here, their voice is here through their recommendations. And as you saw on my previous slide, whatever we put forward to the General Assembly, we will vet and make sure that everyone sees kind of what we've consolidated. Again, we want to be as comprehensive, but we're also on a time constraint with the long session, and it's not going to last forever. Our hope is that part of this solution is a move away from just a summative assessment. 2 years ago now, 2.5, North Carolina was one of 5 states that was awarded from the federal government an innovative assessment pilot. It allowed us to create a system of, if you're familiar with our NC check-in, something that is done quarterly or 2-3 times a year, 4 times a year, that gives snapshots of student progress and can show student proficiency earlier than a summative assessment, and allows students to progress more of a self-paced approach or a competency-based or mastery-based approach. We have developed that. We have lots of people that are on that innovative assessment pilot team, field practitioners, teachers, principals, curriculum directors, and so forth, accountability directors. That we hope that some of these recommendations are part of our multi-measured approach. We hope to move away from just one summative test and make it something that shows progress along the way, where a student can show mastery multiple times a year, and so that they don't have to sit down for a 1 3-hour long exam and have to prove everything they know. All right, I'll pause before we transition to Dr. Miller and see if there's any questions I can answer at this point.
I just want to jump on. You do have the ability to unmute yourself if you want to say it verbally. Feel free to do so. You can also use the chat box to ask any questions you may have.
All right, well, I'm hearing no questions. I'm going to jump into my part. NCSSA, you've heard David mention them. That's the North Carolina School Superintendents Association, and they fall under the umbrella of NCASA. So NCSSA formed a task force in fall of 2020 to look at issues related to testing and accountability. I'm one of the co-chairs of that task force, along with Dr. Travis Reeves from Surrey County. We did some work behind the scenes, pushing the federal waiver. And as you heard David mention, once we knew there was going to be an administration change, setting the stage for the new director of the U.S. Department of Education to get to the point of issuing a waiver. We also looked at state level testing and accountability issues. And then in January of 2021, we sent a letter to the state board with recommendations for testing and accountability for this school year and for the future moving forward post-pandemic. Dave, if you don't mind advancing the slide, please. Some of the things that we asked the state board and DPI to address, and some of these you've heard Dr. Stegall talk about, modify the testing policies to allow for a flexible testing window, allow students learning remotely to take some standardized tests outside of school and establish out-of-school testing platforms, and to eliminate the requirement that the EOC results would count as a certain percentage of a student's grade. We've been able to get some of that, some we're not able to do. I think flexible testing windows, you've heard Dr. Stegall talk about that. I'm not 100, David, where are we on the final grade piece down there? Can you talk about that?
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button.
That's all.
Yeah, can you repeat your question? The final grade piece?
Yeah, will the EOC count as 20 or 25% of the student's grade, or have we got figured out a workaround on that?
That's a great question. I don't know right off last school year. So what we did allow last school year, and we went to the state board, I think that's in state board policy. We allowed school districts to flex that, flex the scale. So in other words, it counts 20% or 25%, whatever it is, but you can put a floor on that. So you can say the lowest a student can get is a 70 or a 60 or 80 or whatever it may be. I'll check back on that and make sure we communicate that to everyone. That's a great question.
All right, thanks. Then we asked NCSSA, asked the state board and DPI to seek legislative relief on some following items. You heard decouple compensation from growth measures for principal and teachers. That's one that is really, really important. Suspend school performance grade calculations for this year. Suspend the calculation of EVOS, modify the school performance grades moving forward. That's more of a long-term request, and then continue to allow districts to select the K-3 reading diagnostic like we were able to do this year. They also requested that state board and DPI seek the federal waiver from the 95% testing rule. And as you heard Dr. Stegall say, that was granted in the federal waiver. Other long-term requests, create new measures of progress in the absence of formal accountability, perhaps include mastery and competency-based initiatives in the accountability model. We favor using Lexile levels to determine reading comprehension and read to achieve. And you heard David talk just a second ago about the pilot that we got from USED, the through assessments. We want to continue to be able to have those and then review what other states might be doing that's innovative that we could incorporate here in North Carolina. So on Monday of this week, this is hot off the press, the task force met with Superintendent Truitt to continue work on long-term requests. One of the things that she has done is set up the task force that Dr. Stegall talked about that he is chairing. This work is clearly important to her. I'll reiterate that she included testing and accountability reform in her list of guiding priorities that she presented to the Senate Education Committee. I do see a question in the chat, so I'll stop and address that. It is very inequitable for schools to create different floors for the 20% testing. This affects many things. If one system holds true to accountability and one doesn't, this affects athletic eligibility, scholarships, GPAs, either don't count the grades as 20% or have a consistent measure / expectation for the state.
So I can speak to that because we addressed it last year. Grading is already inequitable. A grade for an English class in Greene County is not the grade for necessarily the same English class in Wake County or in Catawba County. So I do understand that that students move across districts, but I can tell you, I've worked in Iredell Statesville, I've worked in Rowan Salisbury, I've worked in lots of places. Every place grades differently. And the some districts before now already created a floor. Some districts didn't allow the 20% to be any less than 50 on an exam. So that's already been in place. And the 20% is not, it's not up to just us to waive or not to waive. It is in state board policy, I'm almost positive, but if it's not, it's state statute. We can't unilaterally just waive it. So It is in place, and districts have always had that flexibility of how best to use it. It wouldn't be us changing anything. It's just reiterating, like we did last year, the flexibilities that you have, that some have been doing all along, others haven't. So I understand the concern, but there's no such thing as equitable grading. Every place, every teacher within a school has different scales, different ideas of mastery. So I don't know that that's something that we can solve by a mandate.
Thank you, Dr. Stegall. All right, we've got another question in the chat. Under innovative assessments, what is the feasibility of moving away from check-ins to a true PLC model where teachers can input data from their CFAs that could potentially be monitored by the state for accountability? Pacing guides, standards covered, and any other supporting data could be uploaded into whatever data collection system they want to use, but this would be more meaningful of a benchmark than what's being used now.
So I can speak to that. You can't have a statewide assessment that's different from district to district. So even though you might have CFAs, common formative assessments in your district, and we did in my district, I'm sure most of you do, if we don't have the same measure, we can't compare. Our accountability system is not just comparing the student to the content, it's comparing the student to their growth estimate and the EVA system. So you can't do that with multiple assessments and different assessments. It has to be a standardized, and also within our federal requirement, it has to be, we have to have safeguards and guardrails in place, such as monitoring of student testing. We can't have something that a teacher then would input on their own. It has to be assessed at a statewide level and monitored, just like an ACT or an SAT has been up until this past year. It's been, you have to have administration that's monitored, and you have to make sure that you can ensure that the student did not have assistance and so forth. So I understand theoretically, but we do have federal requirements we still have to follow.
All right, one more. Can you update us on the reading EOG norming? Will that occur if less than 95% are tested?
I'll have to, I don't want to answer that incorrectly. I'll see if I can get an answer to that.
All right, so if you don't mind advancing the slide for me, please, I'll continue. So part of the short-term goals that NCSSA asked the state board and DPI for were to seek the appropriate waivers and legislative actions to decouple compensation from growth measures, suspend A through F grading, and the other things that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Can you advance it for me, please? All right, so some of our long-term goals. We'll be working with cross-sector stakeholders, as Dr. Stegall mentioned, to create a definition of the profile of a North Carolina high school graduate. Going to begin to work to remodel school accountability using a multiple measures model, which is exciting. Indicators could include things such as, of course, proficiency and growth, maybe something like K-3 readiness or closing the achievement gap. Certainly graduation rate has already counted. Maybe we could look at college and career readiness, the number of industry recognized credentials that students earn, suspension and discipline rates, chronic absenteeism. There's lots of things that could be considered. I've not listed, that's not an exhaustive list, so please understand that. But it is exciting, I think, that there seems to be an appetite now to move to a model that will incorporate multiple measures, or as David said, a multi-prong approach. And I think that's where we need to be headed. And then Superintendent Truitt, at least over her administration, it won't happen completely in a 4 or 8 year period, but to begin to lay the foundation for a move to competency-based education. And if you'll advance one more, I think that ends my part, and we are available for questions if anybody has any. Anything you wanted to add, David?
No, I see a question just came through. Is DPI working towards adding in a growth component for students assessed on the Extend 1? Again, I will have to, I don't know that answer. And I don't know if there's anybody, I'm trying to look at I was looking just a moment ago to see if any DPI staff are on here that might be able to answer. And I'm not seeing any, but.
And Jeff, your question about the norming, we're going to have to get with Tammy Howard. Neither one of us knows the answer to that. Sure. Other questions?
So I have one. You all are talking about moving to this new graduate profile, and I think that's a really exciting move. That's going to, as you said, David, keep the tail from wagging the dog. I mean, we build it from the ground up. But some of the things that we're looking at as possibilities there, I've heard the mention of student surveys. And I know that sometimes is a concerning thing to think about as a component of the accountability system, because what if students are just weighing into surveys and torpedoing their principal or those kinds of things? How would you ensure some sort of stability and reliability of that kind of feedback in a profile of that nature?
So, right. Doing a survey is it is an option we're looking at. It is, if you look at the research on it, it is, again, this isn't me speaking. The research shows that it's as accurate as an accountability system can be on showing teacher impact on student. And if you look at things like the way we rate Amazon, or if you go on a vacation, you rate your hotel stay, colleges, the professors are rated. You can't guarantee there won't be an outlier, just like you can't guarantee that, as a superintendent, we had a student one time who was a very bright student that put A on every answer on his EOG, put his head down after 4 minutes and refused to re-engage. You can't guarantee somebody might not do that. You can't guarantee that a student might not torpedo, but I will tell you the way the questions are worded, it's not, is my teacher a good teacher? It is. The survey, if there were surveys, the ones that have shown to be effective are things like, was I given opportunities to show in meaningful ways my understanding, or where was I given opportunities to have one-on-one support when I had misunderstandings with questions? It's more about the pedagogy and impact of the teacher. And again, you can't guarantee a student might not answer in off the wall ways, but the research, and I can't remember exactly where it came out of, it's been from a number of places, have shown that schools that have used survey results of students, it is correlated to how that student, it's very big close correlation to how that student will perform on a standardized test. In other words, it's a good predictive measure. It's not a one size fits all, obviously, but those are the questions that the group would, we're not trying to tell the General Assembly that needs to be. I think the General Assembly would have to get into the details of that. And I'm sure that there will be a lot, that wouldn't be something that would come in the next year, 2 or 3 years. That's something that would have to be developed with researchers and making sure that as much safeguards are put into that as possible. But that's a great question. I asked the exact same thing. How reliable would it be? Would it be trustworthy? Would it build people's confidence, or would it's something that people would disregard? And from what was shared with me, the research shows that if worded correctly, the questions do align well to the predictive achievement of students. So right. we'll do that.
And I will say there are some states that are much farther down this road than we are, and we can certainly look to them and the lessons learned in those states. And I would add that these states have been able to incorporate student surveys successfully. So I think it's promising. I remember several years ago when student surveys came up, and they were overwhelmingly met with concern, I guess, across the state, because they would factor in when teachers had a standard 6. They would be factoring into that. So this would not be used in a way that I guess could be used in a employment decision for a teacher. They would be used in a different way than we were going to attempt to use them 7 or 8 years ago. Right. There's a couple more questions in the chat. Will the K-3 formative assessment be one vendor for all LEAs? I don't know the answer.
I'll speak to that. I'm the business owner of that, and we've gone through the process. We sent out RFPs last December. We had, again, we're in a blackout period, so I'm going to tell you only the parts I can tell you. We were in a blackout period, but we had an RFP that was proposed. Vendors bid on with the RFP. We had a committee that heard presentations over a week's period of time, and there was specific pieces, components of it. And again, it's not just about the tool. It's an alignment to the tool aligned to the science of reading and the 5 pillars of reading. It's a tool that has a support structures in place that if it's a statewide model, for example, that they can provide technical assistance, that they're financially viable so it doesn't fold under after a year or two. We are considering an option that we are keeping all options open. And by that, I mean, if it is one, it's because one is superior and to the others, and that's who rose to the top. If there are options like we have this year of multiple options with vendors, as long as they, to do that, they all would have to meet those minimum expectations and have all the safeguards in place and all the requirements in place. The state board will be presented with recommendations from that committee. The observations have happened, the presentations have happened. The state board in April and May will consider the ratings and the rankings of those vendors, and they will decide, the state board will decide if we want to stay like we've done in years past with a single vendor approach or a multi-vendor approach. Now, it's not just as easy as saying, let's do a multi-vendor approach. We're working with SAS because everything keeps going back to EVOS, as you see. We have to be able to guarantee that that everything's linked to the Lexi score so that we can compare district to district. Back to our conversation earlier about CFAs. If you're using different assessments, you have to have a common anchor to all those assessments. So you're measuring apples to apples. And if you know these vendors, some are using red, yellow, green, some are using 1, 2, 3, 4. They have different ways to measure. And we want to make sure that they're tied to a Lexile study and that they are what we say proficiency for 3rd grade, regardless of the vendor, it's guaranteed across vendor approaches. So you should know, the goal is the board to vote and select no later than May, and that will be made known. And through that, after that, we'll begin the training and PD that's necessary for all the teachers across the state. But we are considering all options that could include multi or single vendor, but it has to, we're working with SAS to make sure it has to link and be reliable for EVOS data for teacher reporting as well.
One thing I would like to throw out, it's not directly related to this conversation, but sort of runs parallel. There is some human capital / licensure reform work that is taking place. Right now, it happens to lie in the domain of the Professional Educator Prep and Standards Commission, which I chair, that will be tasking some subcommittees that have folks from all walks of education looking to find additional ways to determine teacher effectiveness besides EVOS. You know, right now, EVOS only is available for those teachers who teach a federally tested subject that has either an EOG or an EOC. So there is work more related to licensure than testing and accountability, moving to try to find some additional ways to determine teacher effectiveness. Another question, is it better to have one vendor that is housed in NC Ed Cloud or allow multiple vendors to be in NC Ed Cloud? No, that's not a question, it's a statement, I guess. I said it wrong. I need my glasses back on.
Yeah. And I see the one above that around, and I do agree with the scaling about the inequitability. Without a doubt, I agree that, but I will, again, I will say that teachers grade very differently from school to school, class to class, building to building. And that is something that we can't mandate. We can't mandate, and we shouldn't mandate from the state level. That has to be a local decision. I would encourage districts to be equitable and fair for all students. But on the flip side, we had districts who had said last spring, this time last year, that they had students who had seniors, for example, who had not been able to access for opportunity gaps because they didn't have wireless or internet or devices or whatever it may be. They didn't get access to the content, and it was going to keep some students from graduating or keep some students from passing a course, which they felt was just as inequitable. And so they adjusted their scale based on that. So we'll continue to address this. I don't know that the state board, if it's brought up, would be is something they would vote on. And again, and Catherine, you may know, I don't know if the 20%, I think that's state board. I don't think that's state statute. I think it's State Board of Ed, but do you know, Roxanne?
It is state board, and it's something that's gone through rulemaking, and so there's a rule pending, and what can be done with that. So I think it's sort of all up in the air.
That's a great. You're jogging my memory now. So yeah, when we looked at pausing the state board policy or changing it, at state government, there's a thing called rulemaking that goes through. In other words, it tells we have to go through the attorneys and show how we're going to apply this state board policy across all schools and counties. When you go through the rulemaking process, it makes it just as difficult to take that policy back off or to change that policy. It's not something that can be done quickly at all. It could take up to a year even to make a change in a policy because it's gone through the rulemaking process. So to help in the spring, districts had the flexibility. But again, I will check in on that because it is a valid concern. I 100% agree with you. We don't want, as far as athletic ability or student scholarships, that to hurt students. And I will tell you, we work with the UNC system quite a bit. They had similar worries about as an A and A in one county to the next. Do they mean the same thing anymore? Some students didn't get SATs and ACTs. How do they compare students? If you see a lot of state universities have more students on wait list than ever before because they don't know how to compare them like they used to. So it is certainly something we do need to address. So I appreciate you bringing it to our attention.
All right.
If we have any last questions, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat box now. Thank you so much to Dr. Miller and Dr. Stigall for answering all of these questions and giving us all that information on testing and accountability. Really appreciate both of your time. And I'd also like to thank Pearson for being our breakout sponsor. We really appreciate you being a part of this session. I see lots of thank yous, and this was very informative. I'm going to let this stay up for another 30 seconds or so in case you are still typing. We will certainly get to you, but I will end this session just for your next steps. The next session begins at 2:15. It is our last breakout session of NCASA's virtual conference on educational leadership. I encourage you to go back to the agenda and take a look at all of the great offerings for our last session, and I look forward to seeing you in one of them next.